Well, to join me now to talk about the sovereign debt crisis, I am joined by Brendan Brown. He is the author of Euro Crash, the implications of monetary failure in Europe. And he is also chief economist at Mitsubishi MUFJ. Thank you so much for joining me today. You wrote a book that is entitled Euro Crash. Is that what you think is going to happen now? Do you think that this is actually going to ultimately lead to the breakup of the monetary union?
Not to the total breakup of monetary union, but I think there is a high probability of one or two countries leaving the union. On an optimistic scenario, that would start off a train towards a reformulation of the monetary framework within European Monetary Union to make it much better than what we've had during the first decade.
You see Greece, presumably, as the most likely country to leave the Union at the moment?
Greece is the most likely country, and in many ways, when we look at what's being proposed here for Greece, €45 billion package of loans or aid, followed up by another 80 billion, I would see that very much as the culmination of what was essentially a Ponzi-type scheme. Essentially, the Greek debt crisis and alongside that the Spanish and Portuguese problems all came out of a credit bubble in Europe. Europe had a credit bubble just like the US had a credit bubble, and that credit bubble resulted from far too easy ECB monetary policy during the middle part of the last decade. So all the people who went out and bought Greek debt or bought Spanish debt, this was essentially driven by a serious flaw in European monetary policy.
So what happens to those people now? Because a lot of them are banks, of course, who've bought this debt. Will that debt have to be restructured? Is that how you see this working?
Well, using the metaphor again of the Ponzi scheme, what we are actually looking at now is the first layer of people who have claims maturing in the next 2 years. They'll be the lucky ones. They'll get paid out of this bailout fund.
Yeah.
But of course, the people who have debt maturing beyond this 2-year window, they'll be very lucky to get back 50% eventually. I think what would be much more effective than having this type of rescue for the fortunates who have maturing claims soon would be to use this 40 billion euros or eventually 100 billion euros to actually recapitalize the Greek banks and as a base for a new Greek currency with Greece having a devaluation. That would be a much more effective way of using the EU funds than essentially just a bailout operation for a few lucky Ponzi holders.
Because in fact what you're saying is that long term this simply doesn't work. I mean, do you think that long term Greece inside the European Monetary Union is flawed? For
Greece to get back to a path of economic prosperity under which there's any prospect of a lot of this debt being repaid, they have to have a substantial devaluation and lowering of their costs. And that's not going to take place within European Monetary Union.
Indeed. Now, what about the issue of contagion? I mean, Greece is extremely small within Europe, and if they can't get a bailout together, if it's taking such a long and painful process to get a bailout together when there's only 2.6% of GDP for the whole of Europe, what chance is there that we could do this for Portugal, or that Europe can do it for Spain, for example?
Well, Spain, of course, is the giant, and it's pretty well impossible to imagine anything like this scale being available. But to come back to your point about contagion, I think the force of contagion actually operates through the banking system. What we have is now a considerable degree of concern about the safety of Greek banks, Portuguese banks, and ultimately Spanish banks. And you're already seeing funds being withdrawn from those banking systems. Now, to hold this all together, the critical funding will have to come from the ECB. Already, in the last 2 years, we've seen the ECB, through the back door, increasing its loans to the weakest banks in Europe, holding the dodgiest collateral, by about 500 billion euros. They're actually subsidizing this at about 1% per annum.
How far can this continue? Can the ECB keep funding these banks?
Well, if I were trying to give you a guesstimate here, I would say that if the European Monetary Union is to be held together in coming months, the ECB may well be looking at having to provide another 300 to 500 billion of euros through the back door in the form of ultra-cheap lending to the dodgiest of banks holding the dodgiest of collateral. Now, the question is, in many ways, more important even than what's going on in Berlin this weekend or in Athens, is the ECB itself going to be able to get away with continuing to actually spend money in this way without any sort of political check on what they're doing?
You talk about a political check. Germany is digging its heels in. Do you expect to see more of that? I mean, Angela Merkel obviously has an election to fight at the moment, but generally it's going to be the Germans who are going to be paying for the ECB eventually.
Very, very much so. This loan is an aid, and of course if the ECB does all this lending, ultimately Germany is a major shareholder of the ECB. So if the ECB gets left with all this dud collateral on its balance sheet, it's essentially the German taxpayer who's going to be left with it. The key point here really within the German political system is how strong maybe the opposition within the FDP party comes to these sort of bailouts. And when you hear the German finance minister Schäuble talking about Greece being the next Lehman, I think that's a totally misappropriate metaphor. Greece is not Lehman's. Greece is not a bank. The best way of preventing Greece becoming Lehman is to give Greece the opportunity to get back to some sort of economic solvency through a devaluation.
Brendan Bryan, thank you very much indeed for joining us and sharing your thoughts with us today.